Thank you for joining us. Just want to say that this event, I'm speaking on the unceded land of the Lenni Lenape people, as well as the Haudenosaunee and the Shinnecock tribe. So welcome everyone to this event. This is the third in the Emily H. Tremaine Curatorial Journalism Fellowship for Curators. And today we have Frederica Simmons, who's joining us and who's a curator who's been working on Bessie Harvey, as some of you probably know, having read her articles, as well as the recent email exhibition that appeared on Sunday. So I just want to give a brief introduction. Frederica Simmons is a Black emerging curator based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Born and raised in the south side of the city, she's contributed to the preservation of ephemeral street art and associated memory through advocacy and praxis in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, mere blocks from her family home. A member of the Urban Art Mapping Project since 2020, she's contributed to the project's George Floyd and Anti-Racist Street Art Database, which seeks to document street art from around the world created in the aftermath of Floyd's murder. She has been the curatorial department assistant for Department of European Art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, also known as MIA, since 2019. Hi, Frederica. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, you know, I really loved your email exhibition, first of all, because I think you've been doing a deep dive in the work of Bessie Harvey, and I just wanted to start with your first encounter with her work. And as a curator, what were some of the aspects of this project that really spoke to you and that said, okay, this is the person I'm going to devote a few years of my life researching and investigating?
Yeah, the first time I came across her work was actually in the context of a book. And in that book, she was a survey of Black American female artists. And there was all these different genres that they were being considered in. And what really stood out to me was that she was under the chapter that was labeled vernacular. And I was looking at her art and I was thinking to myself that there's so many themes that she seems to be engaging with beyond just being a self-taught artist, that there was all these very obvious other ways of considering her work. And I was wondering, well, why wasn't she in the feminist chapter? Why wasn't she in these other areas? So that really kind of drove me to investigate why we categorize things in the way that we do and the limitations that we have within art history.
Mm-hmm. And so now, do you have a good answer of why she was included in that chapter and not in some of these other chapters, perhaps?
Yeah, well, it's not a good answer as much as just an answer, I suppose. But I think that really part of why her work came to light and to a certain extent is because of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. And William Arnett specifically was focusing on all these self-taught artists in the American South. And so I think that by being clumped into that group with all these other fantastic artists, that kind of meant that a lot of people's first introduction to her was really within that context. And that, again, we have a predisposition to kind of focus on the very first introduction that we have. So in that sense, that kind of stuck with people, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. And so now your own sort of like, I would love to sort of understand a little bit more, like in terms of as a curator, what do you think? Because, you know, I have to say as a critic or as an editor, sometimes there are topics as interesting as they are to me. I go, you know, there's not really much I can add, right? And so I choose not to engage. Now, what did you feel that you could add to the conversation around her work?
I think that because I do so much research in feminist theory, specifically Black feminist theory, so also womanist theory, that again, I was looking at her art and I was seeing all these very obvious critiques that she was making about Black womanhood in America at the time. So that would have been like the mid 21st century, or not, I'm sorry, 20th century. What was she thinking about and what were the impacts of that and of her experience? And really, how could I look at her art and bring these critiques out a little bit more than they had been previously? And I think there's kind of an inherent hazard to that, right? Where we're assigning a label to someone that they themselves did not give themselves. And so being very cautious and very aware of what is the stigma behind that. Why would she not choose to describe herself in this way? Why was she not thinking of herself in this way? And it's very like a multi-layered, multifaceted approach to take, to be ethical and very deliberate in respecting the artist's original intent while still highlighting a different outlook on it as well.
Makes sense. So I'd love to talk a little bit about the George Floyd project you had been involved with, because I think it gives a sense of curatorially perhaps where you're coming from and sort of your own interests. And I wonder if you could like tell us a little bit about that, because with the murder of George Floyd, obviously being so close to home, what did you feel your role perhaps as a curator was? I mean, let's not even take into account as a citizen and as a, you know, all these types of identities we all have, but as a curator, approaching a project like this, if you can just briefly describe it for some people who may not know it, and also just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm currently a graduate student at the University of St. Thomas, and my faculty mentor / advisor there is Dr. Heather Shirey. And Heather's specialization is really in street art and protest art in Brazil. But with that specialization, she was able to have the presence of mind as the events following May 25th, 2020 kind of unfolded. She was able to, again, have the presence of mind to look around and think, this art is so important and this art is so fleeting. If someone doesn't capture it, it's going to be scrubbed away in a matter of days, because these are the narratives that the city doesn't want you to know are happening, because it was internationally publicized. I think the media, well, at least the state media, was trying very hard to kind of control how people were seeing what was happening. But with street art, everything is so very honest and very real that these were the perspectives of the people who are really on the ground. So it was her idea to start this database, along with, there's 2 other faculty on the overarching team. That would be Dr. Todd Lawrence and Dr. Paul Laura, also at St. Thomas. So they banded together and just got it live as quickly as possible. So I think when it went live, there was only one object or like image file on that database, and then it's gradually grown to be, I think, well over 3,000 at this point. But as we were working on the project, there were other opportunities to be involved with other local community organizers who had been collecting boards, like the ephemeral plywood murals that people had been painting. Because once those went down, unless an artist was kind of taking them and bringing them back to their studio, it kind of just, no one knew what was happening with them. So some people took it upon themselves to start collecting them and saving them. And we had initially gotten involved for the purpose of helping to photograph those boards that those people had, but then found out that, oh, there are plans for exhibitions and other projects. And at that point, I had been working in the curatorial field for a little bit, and I was like, I have these resources, I have this knowledge, I'd love to help you. So we kind of embarked on that process, and it was a huge learning curve, and there were a lot of outcomes with it that I wasn't necessarily happy with. But going back to, again, the database project, that's been so very concrete and something very special, that even when other projects go in directions where I don't believe in like the mission of what they're doing, I think that I've always been able to find grounding again in the database project. And that's been something really special, especially as we use geolocation and other forms of data collection. We're able to really kind of trace patterns and see as things change. And there's not just one universal record for any given mural. People can submit, because it's image based, there's that also really is connecting to the ephemerality of the piece. So it's from one person's perspective, how did it look on this day from this angle? So for any given mural, we could have maybe 5 different image submissions over the course of a week, a month, and all of those get to live within the database so that we can really see how it's changing over time. And that's something that's really special.
Absolutely. So what were some of those narratives that maybe surprised you or that you encountered when helping compile this database that, that you may want to highlight so people can kind of understand the types of narratives we're talking about?
Absolutely. I think what's been really interesting that we've been able to very clearly see is that there are clear distinctions in messaging depending on what area, at least thinking of Minneapolis, what area you're in, and how in the more gentrified spaces, the more white spaces, there's perhaps more positive communal imagery like, oh, we're all in this together, peace, love, happiness. And a lot of very like coordinated, sanctioned murals where perhaps they were commissioned to do this work by the business that had the boards on that side. Or, but then as you get into more local neighborhoods, areas that perhaps have more people of color or less interest to the white public, for lack of a better word, like these more diverse neighborhoods, we've seen, while there are still absolutely muralists who are working within their communities and creating beautiful work, like my friends that I chose to highlight in my articles, there's also a lot more graffiti that we were able to capture that were very raw, just really just like a quick writing on the wall that then they would kind of continue on moving instead of the more elaborate designs that we are seeing. So that was a really, really interesting opportunity to kind of analyze what is happening, why is that happening, and what does that really say about how people are feeling? Because again, with the graffiti, we were able to see kind of some more angry messages, some frustrated messages, because we're all angry, we're all hurt, we all feel betrayed. But allowing those narratives to speak for themselves in areas where, again, there's a higher concentration of people of color versus these spaces that they're trying to be more controlled about how people are perceiving the area.
Yeah, understandably. So I put together a slideshow of the images you chose in the email. I wonder if it's all right if I show those and we could talk a little bit about the work, and perhaps you can walk us through. I put them in the order they appear in the email exhibition. So hopefully this will help us understand a little bit about your own process, and maybe if we could talk a bit about the pieces and why you chose these. So this was the first image in your email, birthing. Do you want to talk a little bit about why you chose to open with this and why this image is significant for you?
Absolutely. So this one was actually one of the later ones that I found in my research. And I was very excited when I came across it because it's so very powerful and it's so very unflinchingly real. Like not everyone would be so bold as to portray a labor like almost to its completion, as we can see with the infant's head coming out of her vagina. But I think that what's so powerful about this work is with Harvey's work, she was able to look at a piece of wood and see within it what was just asking to be revealed. And so her ability to look at what would be to many people just kind of a gnarled piece of wood and recognize the opportunity to share this narrative was something that was really impactful to me. And not only the woman's body that she reveals, but also the crown that she found visible, and that she chose to make that a crown and not hair, or that she didn't choose to remove it altogether, that she like really preserved the piece in its entirety was something really special. And thinking also of Harvey having birthed 11 children, that's a monumentous feat for anyone, I think, to even have one child. So I felt like that was a really important way to kind of begin the conversation about her work, looking at this very important part of her identity, but also a part of herself that I think that so many women and so many mothers find themselves feeling only as a mother, but the fact that she began her art making process later in life after her children were almost fully grown, I think was something also really significant that I was considering.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about the material realities around her? Like, first of all, what, how she started making work, how this sort of worked together. I mean, first of all, I just want to say the limbs on this piece are incredible because they seem so obvious that they're limbs, in a way that she's chosen these, and you're like, oh wow, that totally looks like a leg. And that totally looks like an arm. It's amazing. But like, where was she? What did she connect to? Why did she feel like making art objects? Like, could you give us a sense of where that all came from?
Absolutely. So I think from what I understand, both from talking to her family and also from reading interviews that were done with the artist before she passed away in the 90s, she really began art making kind of as a way to keep her mind occupied. She was dealing with a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress for multiple reasons involving her family. After already living a very difficult life, I think that she was able to find a way to really process her emotions and her experience by keeping herself busy, keeping herself occupied, and again, going to the woods around her home and just kind of being one with nature and therefore one with God, in her own words. So then she was able to, like I said, kind of process all of these emotions that she was feeling by producing these amazing works. And she has a huge body of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone is asking in the questions, is it all right if I bring up some questions as we're speaking?
Yeah.
So people, and please, if people have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A or in the chat to us, and I'd be happy to share them during our conversation.
Mm.
Someone's asking about, I guess the fact that the figure is a certain type of black. Someone's seeing the baby as perhaps brown. I have no idea. It's hard to tell from this photograph,
Mm.
but I'm just going to ask that question in terms of, do you see any significance in the way that the baby or the mother figure are sort of are rendered?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think it's multifaceted again. I think that there's both the fact that all of her figures that she made were always people of color. They're always very, very dark to olive skin, that there was a range, but that she was always deliberately depicting people of color and Black people. So I do think that it might be a little bit hard to see in the image, but I think that it's mainly that the baby is kind of caked with blood and afterbirth and all of those great things that come from labor, that I think that maybe it's looking a little bit different to you on the computer. But I also think that typically children who have more melanated complexions are actually born lighter, and then their melanin kind of develops over time. So it's possible that she was also, again, having birthed many children, was aware of that and maybe was very deliberate in that. Or again, it could also just be that the color is maybe a little distorted because of the blood that's covering the infant. But
Absolutely.
again, great question.
So let's go to the second image. Let's see. There we are, Jezebel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this, and again, why you chose it, which I think is really, really interesting. I mean, it's a fan. This one really spoke to me immediately because of the sort of the composition in general and the complexity of the composition, and also the topic. I mean, I'm not quite sure where this, specifically how it's rendered. So I'd love to hear about that.
Absolutely. So this was another piece that was very special, and I regret actually not including, if anyone would like to look it up, on the Souls Grown Deep website, they have more angles of this piece so you can actually see her face better than in this image. But for those of you who are familiar with biblical text, Jezebel is one of the most scorned women of the Bible, unfortunately, because she was viewed as such a devious woman. And that's a trope that's really carried over through biblical times into our contemporary period, where now we are familiar with the term Jezebel as not only a deceitful woman, again from the Bible, but also it's become a slanderous term for Black women that really dates back to the antebellum South and slavery, and ties into all of the manners in which the white men in particular who were in power over enslaved women rationalized their urges to rape and harm these women. And they claimed that, well, Black women, African women are just such sexual beings that surely they, for lack of a better term, that they're asking for it. Right. And so Jezebel has, again, over centuries now become this very sexualized image of the Black woman, and that's an inherently harmful image of Black womanhood. And at this point, by 1987, I'm sure that Bessie Harvey was familiar with the term Jezebel being used to degrade Black womanhood. So I thought that that was a really interested, multifaceted approach, again, where Bessie Harvey was always very, her religious practice and her dedication to the Bible and to her church's congregation, she was very involved and engaged. So she was very familiar with the biblical story, but then she also saw the discrepancies between the Bible and her own lived experience. And her art was often a way to contemplate these discrepancies that she was seeing. And then she would directly often find herself at odds with the Bible through her conclusions that she found with her art. So going back to the piece itself, you can actually see very well her arms are outstretched and her very thin legs are being engulfed by these dogs. Because again, for those of you who aren't familiar with the biblical text, Jezebel is thrown out a window to her death and her corpse is eaten by dogs. So you can see right now that this woman is just, again, engulfed in these animals, and her body is no longer visible as being human. There's all these discolorations to her limbs, again, likely from being thrown out a window, being mauled by animals. She's dying. But what's also really interesting, and again, apologize that you can't see very clearly, but there's all these little faces in her limbs that to me are really reflecting Harvey's animism and her ability to see the life within the object, but also considering all of the women who perish along with Jezebel throughout history, and all of these, again, negative implications and slanderous words used against Black womanhood. So I thought that was really powerful, and I wanted to be sure to include that too.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that description. So her faith was very central to her being and her work, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you see it sort of manifest? Because, in some parts of the contemporary art world, particularly, faith is sort of like not really discussed, right? This is such an interesting sort of question. Do you think that may have contributed to her being sort of outside of the center of this, or outside of the conversation, or being considered sort of quote unquote outsider or anything like that? Do you think that had a role at all?
Absolutely. I do think that there's a real tendency in the art historical canon to look at self-taught artists, and so many self-taught artists that were working in the American South really were also very religious people, and their religion was a conduit for their art or for their considerations of the world around them. It was only natural, to have that pillar to lean back on, especially in the Black community. Religion has been so huge for, again, centuries, that I think that the tendency to focus on depicting religious tropes and stories makes it that it's easier to categorize, the outsider artist, the religious visionary, and not look at them as the full person that they are.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the next image. And then there are a lot of questions coming in. I apologize, we don't have closed captioning. Someone asked about that, but I'll try to set that up properly for next time. These webinars have been something we've been experimenting with in the last couple of weeks. So we're adding features as we go. So thank you for your patience with that. So I wonder if you could say a little bit of this, because I'd like to go and ask a lot of these questions. They're kind of coming in different directions, but also I want to talk about the curation in general. So I'd love to hear about this one as well.
Yeah, so this one, The Seven Faces of Eve, it's actually really interesting because there's a film that was called The Three Faces of Eve, where it was a woman who was found to have like split personality disorder. It was a very old movie, but I wonder
Classic
about that
Hollywood.
parallel.
Classic Hollywood, right?
Yeah, so I wonder about that parallel. And again, surely she was aware of it when she named it and how that impacted her thought process. But while those were the split personalities of that character, the seven faces of this figure can actually be easily counted. Of course, it's a little bit difficult for me to count for you on the screen, but there's the stump is one, branching off of the stump in the back is two, and then there's 3, 4, the little like kind of spindly neck ones, and then 5, 6 at the base, and then there's one more branching off of like in the middle there. That's again very difficult to see, but trust me, there are indeed 7. And this was again so interesting thinking about the biblical text, and of course the first woman Eve, and how Eve is probably, I would think, arguably one of the most unfortunately hated women in biblical history, because she is the originator of the first sin. She is told not to eat the fruit. The snake tells her to eat the fruit. She eats the fruit anyways, and she gets them kicked out of Eden. But not only that, but that as a result, she brings mortality onto all of her descendants, that she brings the pain of childbirth, that she brings all of these awful things that now she gets blamed for daring to question her position in the world, and for daring to, again, work in opposition of what she has been told by not only God, but also her husband. So thinking again about how this historical figure, historical biblical figure, is so demonized and so negatively regarded. What does that mean for all women? What does that mean for women who choose to go against what they're told to do? And what are those larger implications for that?
Absolutely. And then this one, Black Horse of Revelations, another biblically connected piece. And of course, the book of Revelations is always a popular topic for artists in general. I don't know if this is specific, if there's another connotation to that, but I'm curious why you chose this work.
Absolutely. And actually, before we move on, I see the comment that the first woman was Lilith. That's true, but also we know exactly what happened to Lilith, and it wasn't great either. So it just seems like all of the early women didn't have much luck, unfortunately. Yep. But the Black Horse of Revelations, again, another biblical piece. The Black Horse of Revelations in the Bible was really kind of the origin of the apocalypse. And this is such an interesting piece because we look, and not only is that horse amazing, and just, again, something like you were saying, where it's so obvious now when we're looking at it that, like, of course we see this figure, but to imagine having seen it before it was painted and looking at it and saying, this is going to be a horse, is something entirely different. But what I think is really interesting about this piece too is when looking at the figure's face, how very clearly it refers to minstrel characters in blackface, with its lips and the teeth, and just how it's referring to, again, these very derogatory images of Black people. But then how we also see the long flowing blonde hair, and something that's just utterly impossible for the same figure to have at the same time. And then also the beads around this face are painted a shade of blue that's known as haint blue, which is specifically used as a charm to kind of ward off bad spirits. To me, it looks really like she's considering all of the negative stereotypes about the Black image and all of this internalized hatred that Black people are taught to feel towards themselves because of Eurocentric beauty norms. Again, with the blonde hair and the mockery that Black people experience for their features, again, at the hands of white supremacy with the minstrel shows. So to me, really, with this work, she's making the critique that the plague, the apocalypse that's upon Black people, is really this absorption of these white beauty standards and how that impacts us all as people, but again, especially with women.
Absolutely. And I just want to mention, some people have been raising their hands. We'd prefer if you actually ask the questions written, and we'll get to them shortly. This is the last piece in the exhibition, God's Gift to Man. I mean, this one feels a bit of a departure from the others in many ways. And it actually reveals a sense of comedy, I think, that it doesn't exist in some of the other pieces. But yeah, what is it about this one that spoke to you?
Yeah, with this piece is actually massive too. I think that the picture again just doesn't do it justice, but this is truly like a partial trunk of a tree. It's not just a little stem anymore. It's huge and it's heavy. So that she found this massive trunk and very clearly highlighted again the female genitalia that she sees here in this piece, but then also attaches her, she called them dolls. So these little dolls that are expressing all of the variations of what Black womanhood can look like. Because again, that she was only really producing pieces that were people of color, even though they would have a wide variety of skin tones, that her intention was still to be depicting people of color. So that there's this wide array of the Black female experience and what that can look like, but that ultimately making fun of the notion that, again, in the Bible, we're taught that woman was made from man to be a companion by God, and that there was this intention that woman was made to serve man. So again, making the mockery of the tendency for men to focus on female and their sexual the opportunities that are available to engage with women sexually and not as their whole human being. I see a lot of that here again with the genitalia. And then, yeah, it's a great piece. It really is.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to stop this so we can talk a little bit about the other pieces and go to the questions. So first of all, let's start with why you chose to show them in this way. Curatorially, what were you trying to communicate? And I'm curious, like because I mean, she has hundreds of images, I mean, and hundreds of pieces. What was it about these that spoke to you?
Absolutely. I think again that with my research, I've been so focused on how can I make a very clear argument for these are things that she could have been considering at the time without taking away her own agency over her work, and knowing that, especially through my conversations with her children, knowing that she did not by any means self-describe as a feminist, that wasn't, she was just herself, and that she didn't utilize any labels really to define herself. I wanted to be very respectful of that and not make a case for her to be a person that she wasn't. Because that's, again, very important to me for artists to have agency over themselves and their work. So even though she's no longer with us, there are people who can still speak to her intent. So knowing that she was never deliberately doing producing feminist works, like that was not really something that she was thinking about. I wanted to still be able to go, okay, how can I look at these artworks through this lens? And in some ways, it was very easy. I don't want to say easy, but it was more clear how to do that with these direct references to the Bible, to these famous women in the Bible, but then also thinking about other issues that are really prevalent in womanism, in feminism, such as, again, beauty norms and reception of the individual as the mother and whether or not we have an identity outside of that.
Absolutely. And a number of people are asking whether she had access to Haitian or African art, and specifically a few people have asked about Nigerian spirituality or Yoruba culture. I'm wondering, were those at all part of her sort of artistic universe?
So what's really interesting about that is, at least earlier on in her career, before she became found, unfortunately, there's not a better term than that. That's how the artistic community viewed it. as with all vernacular artists, that they're plucked from obscurity and we
Right.
make them. Yeah, awful.
As opposed to
But
acknowledging the structural issues, that's why they were right. Lost.
exactly. But so prior to her being, again, found by the field, I think that she really, from what I understand, was really working just with her own vision and hadn't been exposed that much, but she very firmly believed in the concept of reincarnation, and that the same Black spirits of her ancestors that had existed hundreds of years ago, the people who were in Africa, were still being carried over through her lineage to herself that day, so
Mhm.
that she was able to work from a place where she recognized these perspectives, these narratives, and these histories, and that came forward through her art. But as she was more exposed, she did begin to work more critically with African art and think about her role in bringing this to light more. And actually was known to carry, she was known to deliberately name some of her works with words that were derived from specific tribal languages, which I didn't include here, but again, it's very easy to find, and I recommend that people look into it if they're interested.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so did she own any African art, or what were some of the artworks perhaps that were around her? I mean, were there quilts? Were there other objects that you think may be significant in understanding her work?
That's a great question. I think that unfortunately, because she grew up in such a difficult financial situation, that those resources were really limited to her. But that's, of course, not to say that craft doesn't prevail. And I think that through living in Tennessee and in these regions, that there was always, again, that Black legacy of crafting, like you mentioned, with quilting and other practical but beautiful objects, I think were always surrounding her. But there's actually a point where she was making dolls, because again, that's what she referred to those little figures as, where people, because again, it was a very religious community and they were very involved in the congregation, that her neighbors saw her works and labeled them as voodoo and perhaps demonic and evil. And she was very upset by that and actually destroyed some of her pieces.
Oh,
And
wow.
it took, yeah, because she was so upset by how she was being received by her community, that it dissuaded her for a little while. But that she was able to recognize, I'm paraphrasing the quote, of course, but something along the lines of that voodoo is a religion like any other, and that there's been more evil things done in the names of other religions than there ever have been under voodoo. It was something along those lines. But again, that there is that awareness. At what point that awareness became pivotal, I'm not quite certain, but absolutely she was aware.
That's really interesting. So she was very aware, but she also sort of rejected this kind of characterization of the work. But it also sounds like her Christianity wasn't necessarily like so doctrinaire either, because to believe in reincarnation and spirits and like it's a very personal kind of belief that she sort of put into the word, into her own Christianity, and that
Absolutely.
which sounds exactly like how her artistic sort of practice was, where it's sort of like she's sort of inventing things as she sort of goes along. So there is a question somebody asked about the mounts, and were they designed by the artist? Were they approved by the artist, or did the artist intend the works to be displayed this way, or were they supposed to be handled? So how much of the display aspect was in her idea of what she was making?
Another great question. From what I can tell, that those mounts for the art are all original. And of course, there's also instances where the mounts aren't necessary because, like you saw with the trunk, it kind of stands on its own. But I do believe that it was deliberate and intended for the artist that they'd be able to stand upright on their own.
Yeah. And then someone else has a really, I think, a great question. go and gather the wood as needed, or did she go out collect, or did she keep a wood pile that she was sort of working from? So I guess the idea is like, some people talk about going into the forest and finding an object and sort of bringing out its essence, or was this something a little more complicated?
I think it's like you said, where she'd really go out into the woods when she was feeling inspired to create, and that she'd be able to, again, look into the pieces of wood or other found materials and see what they were asking to be made into, and then just produce from there.
Did you find that she had a preference for a certain type of wood, a certain tree, and did those have any significance?
It's another great question. I haven't seen the type of wood be specifically labeled as of yet. It's more so, at least in archives, just being regarded as found wood. But if we were to really look into what type of trees are growing in that particular area of Tennessee where she was living, because again, she quite literally would just go out of her home and go into the woods and find pieces there.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that somebody sent us. Being a woman from the South, I guess someone's asking if she ever witnessed lynchings. I'm guessing they're sort of seeing some of that in the piece, because obviously trees and there's a certain significance. Have you encountered anything about that?
If she did witness that, she never spoke of it really in the interview material. But of course, I can see why, being a woman of faith and really hope, that she was choosing not to focus on the negative. But that's not to say that she doesn't have some incredibly intense and brutal works. I think that actually when I interviewed her daughter, Miss Harvey Dean, that she had mentioned a thin line or the hanging tree. So again, like that very literal and very brutal vision of the hanging of a Black man as a result of these white supremacist beliefs. So I imagine her lifespan that it's more likely than not, unfortunately, that she would have seen something like that, or at the very least would have heard about it if she didn't witness it firsthand. But again, another great question.
Yeah. How about in terms of her, well, actually, let me ask you a couple of these questions. One was asking specifically, was she influenced by Nellie Mae Rowe? I'm guessing that somebody sees an affinity with Nellie Mae Rowe's work, another artist often labeled as outsider. Wonder if you have any thoughts on that? Or were there any other artists, any quote unquote outsider artists that you see a direct connection to, or perhaps she corresponded or met?
Another wonderful question. I think that she absolutely began to meet other artists as she gained notoriety and as she became more known, so to speak. But as far as whether or not she was directly inspired by anyone else, I can't really speak to. You can definitely see that there's very evident parallels between her work and other, again, quote unquote, vernacular artists that were working in the American South. But in her case, she specifically, was looking, again, she would go into the woods and find a piece that spoke to her, that she saw the form within, and then would help to bring that out. Whereas I think a lot of other artists who are working with found materials at the time would remove aspects of the wood to reveal a figure instead of recognizing the figure as it already existed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love in this event, there are a number of people that seem to have met her or know her. So I just want to read some of the comments that they have.
Wonderful.
Yeah, one of them said, she said to me also, the tree, root, or branch spoke to her. And then someone else mentioned, Bessie told me that when she walked in the woods, the spirits in the woods would actually speak to her. So that's sort of interesting to kind of give another context. And then I'm going to read this comment. It's a little bit longer, so bear with me, but it's another experience. I want to thank you for giving new light to see Miss Harvey, her work and life. I learned about her work in a class called Outsider Art, and therefore my 19-year-old self and my understanding was boxed in, which speaks to what you were saying a little bit about how when we understand them. But I was so inspired by her work that while staying in Tennessee, I called her and asked if I could meet her. What an experience. My regret is I didn't arrive with the intention to purchase work. But at the time I was maybe 22, and when she realized that I wasn't a curator or buyer, the moment changed. I wish I could have described how she gave me directions to her house, a very cherished moment. Thank you, and looking forward to what you do as a curator. So I thought that was a wonderful comment to share.
It is, and it's been so special to know and find out how many people, again, are familiar with her and her work while she was still alive, because unfortunately she passed away awfully young. And it's so special to see how many people she had an impact on. In the words of her daughter, she was a gift to the world. And again, I think that that continues to resonate.
Yeah, and one of the people that also added another comment said, I was a visiting artist at the University of Michigan. This is Lance Rutledge, by the way, in the mid 80s, and became friends with Bessie. I bought a piece from her, a man with 3 women swirling on top of his head. After I brought it back to Brooklyn and lived with it for a few years, I found it eventually too overpowering to live with. That's interesting. So I'd take it to the gallery that then represented her work and have them sell it for me. So I can testify that the work had a real unmistakable spirit. Have you heard things like this? Is this something that's common, or have you heard anything similar?
Again, I think that when she was, and I wish so desperately that I had the book with me, but it's one of those books that the museum librarian doesn't let you remove from the museum, and I have to respect that. So unfortunately, I don't have the book with me, but she had said something along the lines of, again, with thinking about reincarnation and this transferring of spirit, that she was absolutely working with these spirits when she was revealing them, and it wouldn't surprise me at all that these spirits were powerful and continued to live on whether or not they were still with her, that she really was instilling them within the works.
Someone else, Emily Holmes, writes, when she visited her in 1989, she had "Pray at 12 o'clock" written on the mirror in her LR, laundry room, must be, in her laundry room. That's another to kind of give a sense of her religiosity and sort of the role, living room. I apologize. I didn't quite know what LR was. She's clarified. So in her living room, she had "Pray at 12 o'clock," which tells you a little bit about that and what that means. That's so interesting. So now somebody else had asked in terms of conjure culture at the time. I'm not quite sure what that means. Do you know the term?
I can't say that I am familiar. I wonder if they'd be willing to clarify.
Jeffrey, if you could just clarify what you mean by that, we can certainly answer your question, because I'm not quite sure what that means. Okay, so now tell me a little bit about the interview with her daughter, and what you and how that experience was, but also as a curator, when you are doing interviews, what are some of the essential points that you'd like to touch on? Or what is, when you hear it, when are you like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted to get out of this interview? Like, what are some of the checklists, if you can go through that for people who may not know about that process?
Another great question. Well, first, I was so very excited to have even been connected with her daughter, because again, I knew that she had 11 children, but at least from how I like to work, I never want to be that person who's digging through public records to track down people and then popping up on them unannounced in that way and hoping for the best. I'm sure that there are instances where that works out really well for people, but that wasn't what I wanted to do at all. So I kind of resigned myself to the thought that, again, these children are surely out there, but I may not necessarily encounter them. But in the process of receiving image permissions for this project, I had reached out to the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which is based in Atlanta. And my contact there was like, oh, we'd be more than happy to provide you with the images, but you need to get copyright permission from her daughter. And I was like, I will absolutely no problem. I would love to do that. So I was so very excited to reach out to her, and she was so kind and accommodating, got back to me right away and was like, of course you can. Just make sure you credit it with permission from Bessie Harvey's children. I was like, I'd love to do that. But I was trying to, honestly, I was trying to play it cool a little bit. And I was like, I don't want to overwhelm this person with my enthusiasm. So I kind of waited a little bit. And then after the holidays, I was like, hey, would you be open to letting me interview you for this project? And I was trying to be, because again, it's so very important, consent and autonomy over your words and your perspectives. It's so very important that I was like, if you agreed to do the interview, here's like 5 different ways it could go. I could publish the whole thing. I could publish like a revised version of like, here are my findings from having this conversation. Like, you can have it be however you want. But she was, again, so very kind and wonderful, and it was like, whatever is useful to you, I'm happy to do. So I was very excited to interview her, and we actually ended up playing a little bit of phone tag at the beginning. So by the time that we had actually like successfully gotten on the phone line together, I was so, again, just excited and flustered that I was maybe overly complimentary, but I'd rather do that than not seem appreciative. So I was very happy and very giddy, and it took a moment for me to recompose myself. But she, her insight into her mother was just so wonderful, and she had such strong memories and very vivid memories of things that her mother had said to her that she was willing to share with me. And those quotations are included in the published version of the article as well. But, and I wish that I could convey this, but just hearing her speak about her mother was so very, she was so clearly passionate and so happy and excited, and I could tell how very loved her mother was and what an impact that she had had on her children. And seeing again that she was just really a gift to the world, a gift to her children, but to them, she was just mom. I thought that was something so very special. But as far as the type of questions I wanted to ask, I was thinking about the, because again, thinking about what I was trying to do and how, to a certain extent, it's problematic, and the nuances of feminism and why not everyone feels aligned with feminism as a term. There was a quote that really stuck out to me in my research, and it was from Jennifer P. Borum, who had been interviewing Bessie Harvey kind of in like the last years of her life. And after she had passed away, in somewhat of a eulogy to her, she had published an article, and in the context of that article, she said that self-taught artists are made to suit agendas that have very little to do with their work, something along those lines. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's what I'm doing. Oh no. And so being very willing to have conversations about that, I directly asked her daughter what she thought about kind of the perspective I was taking and what I was doing. And that insight was really important to me to kind of consider how I could revise what I was doing and what I was writing about. So that was invaluable. And I think it's so important to, if, in my opinion, at least, if you're going to be so bold as to make an argument for something, you have to be receptive to any opposing views on that. You have to be receptive to how the artist or their family would feel about that, because that's, again, the only ethical way to do these things. So I was more than happy to humble myself and get that feedback, and I really appreciated that feedback as well. So that was really important to me. And then also, I think, again, with artists, that we, by we, like the art historical community, have a tendency to look at the art and not consider the person. And that's something that happens at all stages in art, that whether it be ancient or contemporary, it's just kind of an inherent issue. So I wanted to also take the time to get to know the person as much as she was willing to tell me, like, tell me about your mom. What are your memories of her? What was she like? And again, Faye had the wonderful comment and very important comment of, we only know of her what she was willing to share, that we'll never truly know the person.
Which I thought was such an incredible thing to admit in an interview, and at the beginning where she was like, well, you know, the truth was we didn't really know everything about her, and no one understood the whole person. you know, which I thought was such an interesting comment about the whole process. And I think is speaking to your point also, it's easier to control objects than people. So often some people focus on the objects because it feels like a quantifiable and easy thing to control, which I think also factors into this. So now, in terms of the other thing I found interesting is so many people seem to have works by her. Was she sort of was she really sort of dedicated to getting her work out there? Because I imagine that she was sort of, you know, probably her best salesperson, her own best salesperson, maybe. I don't know. What do you think about that? Or what have you heard?
A great question. I remember that when she first began selling her pieces when she was working in a hospital in her area. And the children of one of her patients came in and saw her piece and was like, oh, this is art, like you can make money off of this. But I'd like to also think that there was, with the people who knew her in particular, that she gave those pieces, or even if she sold them to her friends, but that there was that intention of sharing her art and her work always first and foremost, because although money helps, you know, that artists all need to get paid for their work, that it was deeper than that for her. But and I love that so many people who are here and present with us right now, again, have her work. That's so cool and so exciting. And in fact, I actually I can't think of the forum, but someone recently like sold a piece of her, like I think a mask or something at auction within the past like 5 months, and I just missed it. And I was so like unbelievable, just my luck. Because it was like $300. Like I would have absolutely run up the bill on that one. But I think it's so special that her art is still like that survives and that it prevails, because things like wood, you know, are really there's a lot of hazards. Absolutely. I think with that medium.
Yeah. Lucy Lapard is writing, she bought a piece of hers in 1990 and she believes it was in Asheville. I think it's called Nightmare, a black figure riding a crazy long-necked horned critter. And I've lived with it since, with no bad vibes, but it's wild, she says. So, which I think is such a great comment. Thank you, Lucy, for chiming in. But one of the things, I guess, to speak to this, it's so interesting to me what a broad cross-section of the art world seems to be interested in her work, or have acquired work or curated work. But also the fact that there seems to be some of the pieces you mentioned, a lot of institutions seem to have collected her work in a way that you often don't see with quote unquote outsider artists. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it is really due to the advocacy of the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. I know that William Arnett wasn't necessarily viewed in the best light in some regards, particularly with artists accusing him of taking advantage of them and selling their art for more than they received for it, things like that. But all in all, I think the foundation has really helped to keep the topic of self-taught Southern artists really on the forefront of even like museum radar.
Absolutely.
And they've given, the foundation has given gifts to a lot of museums, especially where I work at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. We have a wonderful collection of quilts and other objects that were acquired from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. Unfortunately, no Bessie Harvey pieces, so I need to talk to whoever gets that one up for us. But I think that that's really played an important role as far as helping people to understand the work. Because again, if you're limited to the perspective of outsider visionary artist, that becomes difficult to transcend. But when you're able to look at it within this broader context of history, it's more accessible to a lot of people.
Yeah, and it does sound like the Souls Grown Deep Foundation have really done a great job in getting the word out and helping, like even connecting you to the daughters. So it's sort of interesting how that institutional support can often make a big difference too, which is, I guess, a question we've always sort of said in terms of artists that are later found. It's really the lack of institutional structure that sort of doesn't allow them to do that. So Jeffrey Wolf does sort of has clarified what he meant by conjure culture. He meant it more in terms of Black spirituality, roots, spells, folklore, and the cultural belief happens alongside Christianity. So, I guess it's understanding that there's sort of this parallel between Christianity, but also this Black spirituality that sometimes may connect more with Africa and sort of traditional beliefs. So would you characterize her sort of faith system somewhat like that?
Yeah, based off of that definition, I would definitely think so. That again, she was critiquing everything that she was being taught by the Bible. It was never, she was always seeing, okay, this is what the church is teaching, but here's my lived experience. And that directly often was in opposition to what the Bible was teaching. So I think that the other belief systems that she had were helping her to better understand her experience in the world and as a Black woman, because again, there's a lot of the reason for the prevalence of Christianity in the Black community in America is directly related to being enslaved people and losing their original faith systems and being indoctrinated into the systems by the slave owners. So I think it's very important to recognize that she could be a religious woman and be devout to her faith while still having that space to think about it in other ways too.
So Mary Kilburn's talk mentions this video about Southern artists called Passionate Vision of the American South. Is that a video with interviews? She's actually asking if she can send you her copy. So, yes, Mary, that sounds great. Perhaps, you can contact us at Hyperallergic and we'd be happy to connect you. And please feel free just to respond to the emails you receive or the email exhibition, and we will receive that if you reply to that email. So that'd be helpful. Someone also shared another experience with her. Marlo Morero Fernandez says, when I arrived to her place, she didn't have her teeth in. And she said it didn't matter. She wasn't bothered, so I shouldn't be. She did also share some intense words about something from the Bible. She told me that if a woman takes in man's seed the wrong way, a cancer will form. She spoke at great length about that. I'm not sure if it was appropriate to share with the larger crowd, but here we did. So thank you. I guess it also speaks to her sort of understanding and how in those sculptures, you really do see a very complex cosmology of different ideas and beliefs that sort of are interacting and sometimes in tension, frankly. I think that's such an interesting point. So Frederica, it's been an hour. It's such a pleasure to talk to you about this. I wonder if there are any last thoughts in terms of where you'd like to take this project as a curator, and talking a little bit about the notion of care, which is something you've talked about in your original piece, but just talking a little bit about what does that mean? Because I think sometimes that word is thrown around and we don't quite understand what it means. Because it's as much about the audience as the artist, as the person. I mean, it could be many different ways care is sort of enacted. So I wonder if you can close out our conversation with some thoughts.
Absolutely. As far as where I'd like to take this project, it is currently the focus of my qualifying paper for my master's degree. So I'm continuing to build off of the research in that sense as I continue to write. That's due in a couple of weeks. So everyone wish me luck as I try and finish that off. But I think that as far as how I define and think about care, again, with my article, a lot of it was originating with my experiences in my hometown in the wake of such immense trauma that this community was feeling and will continue to grapple with. That it became a question of, again, after seeing these projects that I was involved in and then had to leave because I wasn't happy with how they were responding to the need to care, and that they were following these institutionalized patterns, whether or not they were denouncing them. I think that what's so important with how we care for each other is to really, again, put the artist first. That, like, as we've been speaking about, there's a tendency to prioritize art regardless of if that person who created it is living or not anymore. And that, especially for living artists, how do we take care of the people that we have with us right now while they're still here with us? Because life is short and it's fleeting, and what matters most is how we really support each other and look after one another, especially in communities of color, especially during such tumultuous times, as things continue to only, I don't want to say only get worse, but as the internal uprisings continue and as harm continues, how do we show up for one another, and how do we support one another, and what does that look like outside of the institutionalized practice that we're often so deeply ingrained in that we're not always aware? So really looking to ways that we can share time and break bread and be present with one another and care for one another and check in on one another. I think that's what care looks like.
Fantastic. And one last question. I'm just going to ask what the experience of the email exhibition was like, because that's not something that curators are often trained to or consider. And I'm wondering the challenges about that for people who may be interested.
Yeah, what was actually really funny about it was because I was very stubborn and I didn't look at the two that were released prior to mine, specifically because I didn't want to overthink what I was doing. So now I need you to resend me the previous two so I can see them now that I won't compare myself. But I think it was the question of, do I want to show 5 works or do I want to show 20? How much context do I want to give to explain things? While also thinking of, because I'm very institutionally trained, knowing that people have a limited attention span, and if you give them too much to read, they're not going to do it. So I just kind of found a happy medium where I was like, okay, this is readable, this is possible for people to process, and it won't overwhelm everyone. Hopefully, I hope that wasn't anyone's experience.
You know, I will say that one thing I loved about your exhibition was I felt like reading it on a device, like in bed in the morning on Sunday, was really sort of well tuned. Like it sort of had this sort of thing where I felt like I got a whole lesson. I mean, I'd read it before, but I tried to read it with fresh eyes. So I just really want to say thank you for that. And I just wanted to mention to people who are asking about recordings and the questions, we are recording this, but it will probably be released as a podcast rather than an edited podcast, but we're still deciding that. And I want to thank you, Frederica, for your generosity in terms of answering these questions and being open to this process and joining us on this little experiment with email exhibitions and all these other things. And thank you to the Emily H. Tremaine Foundation for helping us create this program to allow curators to sort of think about journalism and email and sort of speaking to a wider public in a different way. So thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. Next week, we will be talking to Dan Cameron, curator Dan Cameron, whose articles will be going up, and this week an email exhibition will appear on Sunday. He traveled down to Chile, where there's a community of artists whose work he's been highlighting. So thank you all, and hope you tune in next Tuesday at same time. And we'll also be doing a webinar then, and hopefully we'll get some of these other little issues worked out, such as closed captioning and other things. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.